Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. This is one of over 700 programs that we've done interviewing authors and bringing in the usual speakers to the Commonwealth Club since the pandemic began. We're bringing them to you live streamed without a live audience, as our usual thing is. And we hope that you enjoy our attempt to bring our programs out to everybody. We actually are reaching more people this way than in our live performances. But those of you who watch later, enjoy. And today we have a great author, Roosevelt Montas. He's at Columbia University, and he has written a book called Rescuing Socrates, which is partially his story and partially about the ideas of some of the main thinkers that have influenced Western culture and worldwide culture. We're going to talk about Gandhi, we're going to talk about Plato and St. Augustine, and also Sigmund Freud. And plus a variety of other characters will intrude. So thank you very much for joining us, Roosevelt, at the Commonwealth Club virtually. You're coming to us from New York, I assume.
Yes, thank you, George. It's a real honor to be here.
It's a pleasure. Your book was really very, very interesting, both on a personal and an intellectual level. So why don't you tell the story, which is fascinating, of how you came to arrive at Columbia? I'm not talking about Columbia in South America. I'm talking about Columbia University.
Sure, thank you, and thanks everyone for your attention. It's the most valuable commodity we all have these days. So I was born in the Dominican Republic. I guess that's where the story begins. I was born in a rural mountain town. I sometimes joke that I was born in the 19th century and raised by people who had been born in the 18th century. It was again, kind of a rural place. We didn't have regular electricity. We didn't have appliances. When I was a young child, didn't have paved roads, etc. So quite a rural place. And then just before I turned 12, 2 days before my 12th birthday, I emigrated to the United States, where my mother had come 2 years earlier. I came with my older brother to Queens, New York. I can't really convey how profound the shock that was, how bewildering a shift that was from where I was to where I suddenly found myself. I attended local public schools, had in some ways the typical experience of poor Dominican immigrants. There was a large and continuing wave of migration from the Dominican Republic. A lot of it to New York, but especially in the last 10 and 15 years, much broader than that. So a very difficult couple of years. Attended the local public schools. In many ways, found myself very lucky to be that the local public school where I was full of immigrants and full of often hardworking and dedicated immigrants. And I just kind of fell in a group of very kind of dedicated students. So I applied myself. I think somehow I understood that I was confined to a life of marginality and dispossession if I didn't pursue a way out, and the clearest way out was through education. That was clear to me early on. I ended up going to Columbia for college. Again, a kind of uninformed choice. I knew that Columbia was the most selective school, the most difficult school to get into that I could go to on the subway. I was really not prepared to be uprooted again. I was really not emotionally, psychologically able to countenance the possibility of leaving my family, the community, the Dominican immigrant community I was part of, to go to some other strange alien place. So I was lucky enough to get to Columbia without knowing what the Ivy League was, without knowing what its now I know to be famous core curriculum was. So there I was in 1991 as a just having turned 18 at Columbia, with again finding myself again in a world that felt really alien and other and at first utterly unscrutable.
You in your story you have quite a few professors, teachers that recognized in you, as you said, one of them wrote, intelligence and sensitivity, that combination. I would assume paved your way at least a couple of the times, made it, opened the door. You did the work, but they opened the doors. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because I think teachers and anyone in that position to be able to do that should be encouraged to do that as often as they see that opportunity for someone that they think can fulfill that role, because this is the way it works the best, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I refer to these people that you allude to as found fathers or found mothers.
Uh-huh.
And even though my, the kind of gulf I bridged was particularly large, the experience of having one or two or three or a small handful of individuals who kind of see you, with whom you're able to make a deep connection, and who, as it were, take you under their wing. That's an experience that many of us have, and it's one of the magic possibilities in pedagogy and teaching, that as a teacher, you have the opportunity to have this decisive influence on individuals, an influence that parents can't have, that relatives can't have, but that for kind of circumstantial alignments of things you can have. Certainly in my case, I've had a number of mentors, of people who, as I say, I felt that they saw me. I felt that I was not merely an instance. I was not merely a figure. I was not merely a part of the pack, but that somehow I felt singled out by. And these people, a teacher in high school, John Philippides, who was the only person, for example, who read my personal statement when I applied to Columbia. He was the person who encouraged me to apply to Columbia. He was the person who guided me through my first reading of Plato, which a text and a thinker that came to be so decisive in my life. Then again, in college, I found myself, and I had a work study job in the dean's office of one of the undergraduate schools at Columbia, and there also met a number of intellectual role models and people who, again, came to play a really important role in my development. This is something that we all require. None of us can make it alone. There is no such thing as a self-made person. We all require this kind of mentorship, this kind of guidance, and it's in part of the reason why I have dedicated my life and efforts to teaching, to being a teacher, because I want to facilitate for others the kind of experience I had, and because I understand so clearly how particularly people who don't have that kind of mentorship and guidance available in their kind of native social environment, how important it is for those people to be given a lifeline, to be shown a path forward. As you said, you can't do it for anybody. All you can do is point the way. All you can do is open doors. All you can do is sow seeds. But those seeds, those doors, those ways that you point to can absolutely make the difference.
Absolutely, and it's it's one of the great rewards of being a teacher, and it's a kind of one of these very abstract things too, because the reward is imagined. You're paying it forward, like you get this advantage, you pay it forward. You're hoping the next generation, and you know that those opportunities will not be grabbed by everybody. But if your judgment's really good, as whoever your mentors were, the judgment was very good, then it moves forward. I was just thinking while you were talking, and looking at your book, Rescuing Socrates. The story about how you first got the book of Plato is also interesting. And I was wondering if you took Rescuing Socrates from taking him out of the possible trashing of his book and rescued him from that.
Yes, that's the primary resonance of the title of the book. There is also kind of subsidiary resonances. I talk a lot about that moment in Socrates' final days, in which his old friend Crito visits him in his jail cell and tries to get him to escape, tries to rescue him from his impending execution. And then, of course, there is a broader argument in the book that has to do with recovering, revitalizing, renewing liberal education and renewing the study of sometimes called canonical thinkers or great books, but invigorating the role that these foundational texts can play in an education. So all of those resonances are there. But if you can indulge me in just briefly sketching out how it is that I came across this book. I was a sophomore in high school. It was winter, living in Queens in a rented apartment, and American neighbors next door, an elderly couple, who I regret I never really got to know. I didn't speak English; they didn't speak Spanish. By that time, I had been in the United States some 3.5 years, so my English was coming along, but it wasn't quite there yet. On a garbage night, in New York, you put out the trash in the sidewalk, at least in Queens, and 2 nights a week, and the garbage trucks come in the morning, pick them up. On a garbage night, they threw out a bunch of books. There was just a huge pile of books out there. So I went to see what was there, and they were some of the books were gorgeous, and in particular, there were some books that I've come to understand were part of the Harvard Classics, Universal Classic series. It was a series published under the oversight of newly retired President Eliot of Harvard, and they were gold edge leaved, fall leather bound, stately, gorgeous objects, just as books. I took 2 of them. I didn't have bookshelves or really the capacity to read, but I grabbed 2. One of them I recognized in the spine the name Shakespeare, and the other one Plato. I took those, and it turned out that the collection had the dialogues that record the last days of Socrates, the apology of Socrates, the Crito, the dialogue I just referenced that takes place in the jail cell on the days leading to the execution, and the Phaedo, the dialogue that records the last conversation that Socrates is supposed to have had. And I, started making my way through them, and the figure of Socrates just spoke to me so powerfully. And it was that book, as I've already alluded earlier, that in my school, a teacher saw me in the hallway reading this book, John Philippides, and came over to me and said, "What is this?" And that began what has been a lifelong relationship, and with probably my most important mentor.
It's really amazing, Roosevelt, that you were only 3.5 years into being in the United States, and the book that you learned English on was Plato. I guess most people skip him until the end.
Yeah, there was one other book that was even more decisive in my learning of English, and that was the King James Version of the Bible. About a couple of months after I had come to the United States for kind of complicated family reasons that I could get into, but probably won't. I ended up living with my brother in a distant relative's house. And they, in that household, were Pentecostal Christians, and were at the moment undergoing a kind of religious revival that moved them a few inches into in a liberalizing direction, but only a few inches, I emphasize. But I was caught up in this kind of revival, and spent some years really as a kind of fervent, born again, evangelical Christian, reading with just all the intensity and devotion that I think a disoriented teenager can muster, reading the King James Version of the Bible. And that was the really decisive literary influence or linguistic influence. I often remark about the fact that I thought that I was working out my own salvation when I was reading that, and in a way I was, but more mundanely, I was really learning close reading and interpretation in that in that intense biblical study that I put myself through.
Yeah. Well, you moved it from the Bible to several other things, and one of the fascinating things, of course, and you mentioned it, is that when you found Socrates and thought about him a little bit more, you realized that he had come several hundred years before Jesus, and ended up influencing the ideas in the Catholic Church, etc. But let's talk a little bit about Socrates and your finding of him and the ideas. Well, before we do that, actually, there was another thing on my mind. You talk about liberal education, and you made a very good distinction between research universities and liberal arts education, and what they focus on, what their goal is. And then again, there's a third set of schools that seems to be influencing that even more, which is technical schools, preparing somebody for a career. And that seems to be influencing even more the research universities and the liberal arts colleges. But why don't you draw the distinction between them?
Thank you. Let me begin my thinking about that distinction with a quote from Socrates, from the Apology, where Socrates says that the unexamined life is not worth living. And that could be a motto for the meaning of liberal education. Liberal education takes as its point of origin this condition under which we live of freedom and self-determination, and turns our attention to that inner experience of freedom and this remarkable capacity we have to organize our lives according to our own conceptions of the good. And that freedom is both wonderful and terrifying. And of course, many people will find every way possible to avoid having to exercise that freedom and organize their life according to their own conceptions of good, and are looking for structure, are looking for guidance, right?
Right.
So liberal education takes that condition as its point of origin. And then you ask the question, what kind of education best equips an individual to fully live out that freedom? That is to, in that space of freedom, most fully develop their human capacities. And then there is a corollary to that point of our experience of ourselves as free individuals, is that then we organize ourselves into self-governing autonomous communities. And it's no accident that the idea of liberal education was invented in ancient Greece, in the democracy of Athens, a slave democracy, right? So when we speak of Athens as a democracy, we are actually using the rhetorical figure called metonymy, where we take the name of the part and use it to describe the whole. You know, right. when you call, a business person a suit, right? You take the part and you make it stand for the whole. Well, that's what we do when we think of.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you call all people men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we do when we talk about Athens as a democracy, because actually the greater part of the population did not participate in the democratic project. There were slaves, women, foreigners. But if you take that portion of the population that did participate in democracy, that was a direct democracy. Every citizen of Athens held political office, and this had many political offices were by lot, by lottery. It was your turn to serve a political office. They all sat on juries. They all participated in the debate and formulation of laws. They all participated in formulating military strategy. So what kind of education is appropriate for the free person, for the individual, for the citizen who is to take a responsible, active role in this collective act of self-determination? That's the origin of liberal education. And for many hundreds, millennia, it was a dominant conception in higher education, that somehow higher education would prepare an individual to exercise the full range of capacities that any adult self-governing agent can develop. Probably beginning in the scientific revolution, 17th century, or late 16th, 17th, probably into the 18th century, a whole new relationship began to develop between knowledge and nature, knowledge and usefulness. And the research university, which really assumes its modern form in the 19th century in German, and that model of the German research university becomes really decisive, one of the decisive influences in the American research university, the evolution of the American research university. And the idea there is the accumulation of useful knowledge. You investigate following scientific protocols of knowledge acquisition and testing and experimentation and reproducibility, and you build knowledge that is applied, knowledge that is useful. And of course, to that project of research, I call it the research ideal, that project of investigating, accumulating, and extending knowledge, we really owe modernity, and we owe modern medicine, and we owe this technology through which we're speaking. And you can't discount the value of that. But at the same time, there was this other aspect of a university education that had to do with the cultivation of people, that had to do with investigating questions for which science does not offer us an answer, investigating questions for which the accumulation of knowledge did nothing to resolve. You know, we don't know better today than Shakespeare did what it means to be in the grip of ambition, or to be racked by guilt you can't get rid of. We don't know today any better the answer to the question that Cain asked God, am I my brother's keeper? You know, the latest novel about the COVID pandemic doesn't supersede Camus' The Plague or Boccaccio's description of the plague in the Decameron. These human questions are not ones that progress through the accumulation of knowledge. And they are questions that are in fact the most important questions in our life, the questions that ground us, the questions that give our lives meaning and significance. Well, those questions have been largely squeezed out of university education, out of the research ideal. And it is one of the reasons why liberal education is a kind of endangered species in our universities today. It survives, but always under threat and always in kind of existential crisis. And forgive the extended answer to your very good question.
That was great. And what the irony that I saw that you didn't go into, because you're focusing on the distinction between the liberal arts education colleges and research universities, is that the goal of just preparing someone to do a career, that is to give them the knowledge, the practical, useful knowledge that will help them do a job. That's yet another goal, because that's not accumulating new knowledge. That's just imparting the knowledge that was gained. So it's as if there's three main goals of higher education now.
Indeed.
And part of the problem is the cost of higher education keep increasing. So the ones that are not practical, the goals that aren't practical are going downhill. Now, the liberal arts one is furthest off on the edge because it's so abstract what the goal is. Yeah. But the research university, there's obviously a lot of money left for that. But the technical training could take over and push the research university to feel the way liberal arts feels today in the future. Yeah,
it can. And one thing that especially concerns me is the increasing class character of that distinction. You know, it seems to me that the institution of the liberal arts college, let's say, the residential four-year college in which a student pursues a non-professional area. I think that those institutions will persist, even though we are, there may be more now than will make it out of the current kind of restructuring of the economy and higher education. The elite, the global and domestic cultural elite, I think will continue both to send their children to many liberal arts colleges and continue to finance them through donations, gifts, etc. But the danger we're facing is that kind of education will become, again, as it used to be, the exclusive purview of the elite. And with the vast majority of the population being steered to technical, pre-professional, vocational education, much of it online. And that will, I think, be a betrayal of our democratic ideal. The story of American higher education has been in some ways a triumphant story of ever broadening access to college education, ever broadening access to liberal education. And that process has gone into reverse. We are seeing colleges again retrenching into their traditional roles as not ladders of social advancement, but as reproductors of social hierarchies. So this increasing orientation of higher education towards simple, practical, pre-professional technical applicability, in a strange way, is a threat to our democratic project because of its class structure. And I should say that we need technical education. We need, people who can make our economy work. People who can fulfill these roles that we require in our economy. But we mustn't do that at the expense of a liberal education. I am sometimes people just call me an advocate of liberal education, which I am an advocate of liberal education, but I always take pains to distinguish that from being an advocate of the liberal arts major. I mean, I like the liberal arts major. I was a liberal arts major myself. I teach liberal arts majors. I love liberal arts majors. But what we need is not for more people to major in the liberal arts. What we need is for everybody, whatever they major in, to have a liberal arts education. We need our doctors. We need our plumbers and our carpenters and our manufacturers and our lawyers and our business people and our ministers. We need them all to be liberally educated, because liberal education concerns ultimately our condition as free human beings who participate in self-governance at the individual and the collective level. Everyone who is faced with the existential responsibility of organizing their own life and participating in a democratic society is the subject of a liberal education.
Yeah, and there's really not a conflict between those three goals, as you said.
Right.
The research university can have some people focus totally on acquisition of new knowledge. That's not a problem. Nobody's against that. Nobody's against, like you said, people developing the skills for what their career is. In a way, though, the liberal arts education, this attempt to stimulate your mind to think more clearly, basically, about everything, including yourself, to investigate yourself, is something that, as you said, is good for everybody. It's very hard to monetize. But almost all the best things in life are very hard to monetize. And that's why they are retained. And I like what you said about the elite focusing on it and saying that's what they want their children to do. And I think that should give everybody a clue that that's a very crucial part of life. I mean, I also was one of the beneficiaries from the post-World War II era when a lot of middle-class kids were given scholarships to go to the good schools, et cetera. So in the same sort of way, and there was, as you said, much more of that then than there is now. And as part of it is the irony is that a lot of the people that got that are sending their kids and making sure their kids go. So it squeezes the situation. Anyway, let's take that. Oh, one analogy that I had for that, was you talked about the elite, is if, all cultures in the world have a lot to offer. We're going to talk about a few from the West and plus Gandhi, but all cultures have something to add to exactly that liberal arts education. And people seem to be a little bit jealous about their characters from their culture, but it's a little bit like an all-star baseball game. It's like, these are our all-stars and here's your all-stars. And we all like to watch the all-stars play once a year, but most of the time, we're parents watching our children do amateur musical productions. And so the local productions in culture are what we focus on. But it's good to know what the all-stars do in every culture. I think, and I know that the elite is headed in that direction, but it's really useful for the whole world as a race to kind of get that common culture of the all-stars from every single culture, because it's not that hard. It's not, right. As you said, the Harvard Classics was a 5-foot shelf. You don't even need all those. You could, but anyway, the process can be stimulated by all kinds of different thinkers. Yes. It doesn't have to be a particular set of them, but it's that process of stimulating the thinking that's crucial.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's go to Socrates. We'll start with him. The unexamined life is not worth living. So you read this 3.5 years into English, when you're in high school. That's unusual enough. But what did you walked away with a lot of very interesting ideas. It's interesting how you walked away with different things from these different writers and then combined them. But to me, Socrates is a little bit like the secular inspiration for what a lot of people do in religion, actually.
Yeah.
That's what
I mean,
philosophy should be.
yes, it really struck me, even on that first reading of Socrates, that in a way he's a kind of archetype, and my immediate point of reference was Jesus, right? But Socrates is a man who goes around teaching. He gathers a following of young people. He encourages them to think about the good life, to think about justice, to think about the nature of love, to pursue truth to wherever it leads. He is criticizing the powers that be, who quickly come to see him as a threat. They put him through a sham trial. They find him guilty. They execute him, and then his followers begin a kind of philosophical school, right? So, I immediately saw the parallels to Jesus in that, and it was one of the early indications to me that, you know, as I put it in the book, Jesus did not have a corner, did not have the market on virtue corner to himself. There was something going on. Socrates gives us a vision of the examined life, but also of the uncompromising commitment to ask questions and investigate the nature of our human experience, right? The unexamined life. What does that mean to live a life examined? Well, the first thing it means is that your life is a worthwhile object of examination. Your life is not obvious to yourself. You may think you know yourself. You may think you know yourself exhaustively, but exactly to the extent that you think that you are deluded. You yourself are a mystery. That's the first lesson you take from Socrates, that the self as an object of examination. A second lesson you take from Socrates is the centrality of dialogue in that examination. Right? I love the fact about Socrates that he doesn't want to be out in the woods walking around, or sitting in a cave introspecting. The way to examine your life is to spar with others, is to engage others in a dialectical, right? A dialogue, in a dialectic, where one position is put up against another position, and you try to resolve it by finding common ground and asking further questions. So the centrality of dialogue, which means the centrality of relationship, in the Socratic method. We think today the Socratic method is Q&A, right? You can't just do that on your own. One of my favorite, please go ahead.
The Socratic method is often said, I went through law school, is often said that by the teachers, I'm using the Socratic method. But what I think fails all the time is that they don't have the motive right. The motive is not to intimidate other people. The motive is to elicit from them, to bring out of them what knowledge they have about themselves. And if you don't have that motive, it's not the Socratic method.
Yes, absolutely agree.
And I think that that's a crucial distinction, because a lot of people just take it and say, I'm using the Socratic method, see how foolish I made that person look,
Yes, exactly. It's not just the method.
That's not the Socratic method. You blew it.
Socrates says
it that way. Yeah.
The beautiful life, the good life, and the just life are the same. I find that so powerful. The idea that beauty, truth, and goodness are aspects of one same underlying quality. You cannot be really beautiful if you're evil. You cannot be really beautiful if you're unjust. That there is this kind of unity of the virtues, and there is unity of knowledge. Now, that idea of the unity of knowledge, the idea that kind of all truths are consistent with each other, that all knowledge is related, that this thing over here is related to that thing over there, that's a metaphysical position. That's a kind of epistemological commitment that you'll find in Plato, but one that is not universally accepted in our kind of epistemic regime. You talk to people all the time, and they will just say, well, everybody has their own truth. Everybody has their own narrative. Everybody has their own story. What may be right for you may not be right for me. And that kind of superficial relativism is so pervasive in our culture. But when you put that under critical pressure, when you examine that, when you ask the deeper questions, you do seem to move closer and closer to universal points of convergence. And I think whether, and I think it's doubtful, it's unclear whether Socrates thought that we could really ever get there. But the fact that we can move closer and closer, the fact that there are degrees of correctness, the fact that there is such a thing as truth, and that we can be further or closer to that truth. If we cannot hold on to that notion, if we cannot organize our lives, our social lives, our individual lives on that bedrock understanding of truth, we open ourselves to absolute chaos. And I think that the flourishing life, the life of a flourishing human being, is impossible without an underlying sense of truth and what the Greeks used to call virtue.
Different definition of virtue than we have. Why don't you explain that? Arete means something slightly different.
Yeah, in my book, the first chapter is on St. Augustine. The second chapter is on Plato and Aristotle. And one of the things that I bring in Aristotle to do is to really elaborate on this notion of virtue. As you said, the Greek word is arete, and I find that a more intuitive translation of that word is excellence. So, Aristotle talks about the virtue of a knife. The virtue of a knife is to cut. That is what makes a knife excellent, is its ability to cut. So the virtue of something is the excellence of something. So when we talk about human virtues, we are talking about the most excellent manifestations of our essential humanity. And of course, Aristotle will say, well, our reason is a constitutive part of our humanity. So human excellence is going to involve the use of reason in some way. But Aristotle also thinks, friendship is a part of it. So the human excellence is going to involve friendship. And he says human beings are by nature political animals. So somehow our fulfillment, our excellence as human beings is of the sort that can only emerge in the context of a community. So this notion of human excellence commits you to a conception of the good, right? Human excellence is a function of the good, which was the great pursuit for Socrates and for Plato. One last thing I want to say about that is that unless we have a conception of the good, we do not have a conception of excellence. Again, in our contemporary kind of postmodern epistemological regime, the notion of the good and the notion of truth have come under great suspicion. And I think it's important to question those notions. And I think a kind of skepticism and suspicion is salutary. That is the basis for inquiry. But those categories have to continue to orient our inquiry. That's what makes it a Socratic method, right? It is oriented towards the discovery of excellence and the pursuit of truth.
Yeah, it's fascinating that this, you say before, we all have our own truth in the relative, extreme, superficial relative version of it. Everybody has their own intuitions about life, their own reactions, their own perspective on it. But can they explain it to anybody else? And can they explain it in a way that's internally consistent and externally consistent? You can believe whatever myth you want to, and lots of people are believing lots of myths about what the order is behind, the politics, for example, stuff like that. But if it's not consistent with the facts, it's not consistent with reality. I mean, I think the Greek experiment is to say, okay, well, let's take everybody's intuition and let's measure them and see how are they internally consistent, and usually that fails. And if they're internally consistent, do they actually explain what we see externally? We're in a shared world, and if we're going to get someplace of a really shared understanding of it, we have to use the Socratic method on each other, basically. And come to what's shared.
One of the things I love about teaching undergraduates is that undergraduates often come to college, and I was this way when I was 18, and probably so were you. But they come to college with a unconscious set of certainties with values and assumptions that are taken as solid ground, but which are kind of unarticulated. They're unconscious of them. And one of the things I love about the kind of discussions that a liberal education gets you is that it forces or it challenges the student to articulate, to give precise formulations to what they have taken to be the case, what they have taken to be truth, to the governing assumptions that organize their conceptual world. And many times when you try to give them precise formulation, you see that they don't hold up together. And you know that I've heard this so many times, and it's when I hear this, I feel that I have done a good job as a teacher. Is when a student comes to me at the end of the year of a year-long study of, you know, moral, ethical, political, philosophical questions that says, you know, in September when we started this, I thought I had it all figured out, and now I am absolutely confused. Now I have no idea what's going on. Then I think I have done my job.
Well, you're hoping that they'll put it back together at some time in a different order, but still, yes, that
exactly, because you need that. You need that moment of, you know, what Socrates called the aporia, that moment of bewilderment, that moment of puzzlement, before you can move on to knowledge.
You made another really good point in your book, which you said, for the highly educated, it's very important to learn not to ask questions, and basically to not be obedient. Okay, and you said that's even more important for people who are in the working class or in any other thing, because they're trained to be obedient for all kinds of reasons, some positive, mostly negative. And you know, when you compared Socrates and Jesus, you know, they're both on the same mission, but it's unfortunate that Jesus, what he left behind, got turned into an organization that requires obedience, and what Socrates left behind were not what he wanted. He told Plato and everybody else, don't write anything down because that's not good. And you know, you can tell Plato is laughing as he writes down Socrates saying, don't write anything down, you know.
Yeah, well, you can go to any philosophy department today and realize that what Socrates tried to leave behind, and even Plato tried to leave behind, did not persist. No,
did not persist, exactly. But fortunately, the book is still there for some individuals to go back and say, oh, there it still is. And actually, even the Gospels behave that way too. You can still come back and say, hey, why is everybody saying this when it says this here?
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, that's the wonderful thing about books, and there's you know, there are other in the Platonic account of Socrates, you know, the Phaedrus says, you know, forget it. Writing is evil. Writing is going to destroy your memory. Right. Writing, you know, forget that. But there are other accounts, non-Platonic accounts of Socrates, in which Socrates is a reader, in which Socrates says, you know, I enjoy nothing more than reading old books and discussing them with friends. Yeah, and there's the key, right? The book itself is not going to do it. You cannot get a liberal education in these books by just reading them. You really have to engage in conversation, in discussion, in examination with another mind, in animating that carcass, in animating that form, in breathing spirit and life into that form. And that takes people, that takes conversation.
Absolutely. But I think now we're both enthusiasts for Socrates. So we've spent a lot of time rescuing Socrates. We need to cover Augustine. And so why don't we switch to Augustine, and quite an interesting character, as you said, wrote Confessions and City of God, both highly influential. Certainly his ideas had a major impact on the Catholic Church and its organization. But tell a little bit of a story, because a lot of people, you know, we'll take the name Saint off of him, just call him Augustine for a second and say, what kind of a character was this, and how did he become so influential? You did a great job.
Saint Augustine is one of the major philosophers in the history of Western philosophy, and the fact that he was in the Catholic Church, the fact that he was a saint, I think can mislead people into thinking of him as a narrowly religious or a narrowly kind of doctrinarian thinker. St. Augustine is driven by profound curiosity. St. Augustine is one of the most curious minds you will ever meet. In City of God, which is, you know, a huge book. It's like 1,400 pages or something in the Penguin edition. When you get to like around page 12 or 1,300, one of the questions he comes to grapple with is, why do men have nipples? Just St. Augustine is endlessly curious, and this quest for knowledge and to learn is the thing that makes him so valuable, which is the opposite of what many people associate with religious thought. And another thing that's really important about St. Augustine is that in the ancient world, no one is as transparent in their investigations of their inner life as St. Augustine. St. Augustine writes his book, The Confessions, which is the story of his conversion to Christianity. And before he became converted to Christianity, he was like a star teacher of rhetoric. And rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Like St. Augustine had at his disposal the expressive tools, just kind of at the top of the game of being able to express complex ideas. And he turns all this attention to his inner life, to the flow of his own mind and the movements of his own heart. And what we get is an exploration of the self, of human consciousness, of questions of the highest order, of faith, of truth, of the good, that is absolutely breathtaking. And when I encountered St. Augustine as a freshman in college, when I was trying to figure out the whole world, including my own faith, which I was losing at that moment, St. Augustine was a kind of lifeboat, a kind of lifesaver that gave me a vocabulary with which to explore myself, but also an intellectual framework with which to come to terms with questions of faith.
Yeah, and you tell the story about some of his commentary on himself, and in his conversion, for example, his prayer to God about being patient with him. And why don't you tell that one? Because
it's one of the things that makes St. Augustine so endearing, and where you can see his honesty. And he famously asking God to make him chaste, but not yet. And Augustine has
There's a lot of middle-aged people who feel that way.
He has this disarming honesty about himself. He has this. He never stops asking questions. And again, the Confessions is not a book of answers; it's a book of questions. Although he realizes that he can only ask the questions from a place of settledness in his heart, and it is that settledness in the heart from which he can ask the questions that God provides for him. God, there's a question about to what extent St. Augustine's God, this kind of metaphysical, epistemological, ontological anchor point, is the same God as the congregants in he was bishop of Hippo, and he had a small congregation of probably entirely illiterate congregants. There's a question of whether the devout congregants that he was shepherd over, their conception of God is the same as the philosopher's conception. That's a question, but it is from that place that St. Augustine allows himself to ask the big questions, and to ask them in such an illuminating way that they continue to be meaningful to us today, because we ask the same questions.
Yeah, I always think that there's so many different versions of Christianity with their different, very slight differences, and the differences are mostly theological. I always wonder whether if you didn't have an ecumenical conference and all the leaders of those different versions would come together and put into a hat as they go in a piece of paper that included their special version of what makes them unique. And then they would have their conference, and on the way out, they would have to take another piece of paper out of the hat, and that would be their new special thing, and it would be somebody else's from before. Because I have this hunch that 90% of their congregants would never notice that anything changed.
Yeah,
as you said,
so.
Did his congregants have any idea what he was thinking? A little bit, probably, but not much.
Yeah.
The theology is not what everyone focuses on. What they focus on is the emotional resonance of the stories, and the fact that somebody loves you that's not your parents. And I think that actually goes back to what you were talking about earlier about the teachers that influence your life. Your parents, if you have good parents, those parents have always told you you're good and you're going to be wonderful and you're going to be a great adult and that kind of thing. But by the time you're a teenager, you get very suspicious about this parental, sort of, over indulgence in you. So it's always great to run into people as a young adult that tell you, oh no, you've got what it takes, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, who are able to turn your sight in that direction so you can see it, And this is something Plato says in the Republic, that education isn't what people think it is, of putting knowledge where it doesn't exist, or like giving sight to the blind. But education actually takes for granted that sight is there, but it's turned in the wrong direction, and turns it in the wrong direction. This turning around is what education is. And the learning what is the best way to turn it around is the process of education. I have a colleague at Columbia who put it this way, that education is the non-coercive restructuring of desire. And I love that. It's the non-coercive restructuring of desire.
Yeah.
And that's what you do to the student in the liberal arts classroom. You reorient their desire, you reorient their affect, and you turn their intelligence, you turn their eyes in a certain direction, and they do the seeing. They do the seeing.
Yeah, that's right. It's crucial, because to be happy, which is what everybody's going after, as Aristotle mentioned, that's one of the fundamentals. To be happy, what you have to do is fulfill your desires. But the quality of the desires is crucial to the quality of the happiness that you get from them. And so the whole focus is, what's the most intelligent form of desire in our pursuit? You mentioned self-interest, and people are, have always been somewhat against self-interest, but it's in your self-interest to have higher quality desires and higher quality happiness. And so I don't think self-interest is the enemy at all. It's how clever are we about our desires?
Exactly. Is the conception of where our self-interests lie.
Yeah.
But what are our true, enduring, and permanent self-interests? That's the liberal arts question, right? The liberal arts question is, what are our truest and most permanent and enduring interests?
And as Aristotle said so long ago, friendship is certainly one of them. And that's not, and people don't think of that as self-interest if you do things for other people, et cetera. But I think, and it's not thought about a lot because, lust is so popular. That's supposed to be, one of the main things to go for. But I think most people, without thinking about it, prefer trust to lust. If they can create trust in another person, that's like a success story. You've made another mind trust you. Now, some people do it, by lying. But if you do it by being honest, it shows that you're confident in what you're doing. I mean,
it doesn't satisfy. Yeah,
it doesn't satisfy if you lied your way. Yeah.
Yeah.
If everyone's in love with you for what you lied about on the online dating site, what the irony is we spend all this time trying to create that, and whenever we succeed, we discount the opinion because we know that they're too dumb to see through your lie.
Exactly.
So there's so much psychic energy goes into it, and it's a fundamentally frustrating experience. It's just very interesting.
Yeah. Adam Smith makes this very astute point in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? His other great work is best known, of course, for the Wealth of Nations. But he says we have this internal desire, this need to be well regarded, but to be well regarded for true reasons. Yeah. That is, if the need is not satisfied, if we're falsely well regarded. It is only satisfied by being rightly well regarded for the right reasons.
There's quite a few famous people that could use that advice. So you rescued Freud a little bit, because he's on the outs pretty much in academia, but he had some, in spite of all of his baggage that's not very useful, he had some real insights. So why don't you talk about a couple of those insights, and then we'll get to Gandhi.
Thank you. So someone suggested that my next book should be Rescuing Freud, which I don't think will be the case. But indeed, Freud really gives us opens up a whole new way of thinking about ourselves, our consciousness, and our human reason. Probably the key insight that Freud has is the pervasiveness and dominance of unconscious mental processes in the way that who we are and our sense of self. We live with the illusion of control, the illusion of transparency. I know who I am, and I am what I am by knowing myself to be that thing. Mm-hmm. But Freud, I think, demonstrated quite convincingly that is an illusion, that in fact, there is a tremendous amount going on underneath the surface that's out of our conscious radar, but which in fact determines and dominates our conscious life activity. And I give an example that if you, to illustrate how out of control our mind is. If you imagine you drive to the grocery store, between the time you get in the car to the time you get there, your mind will have all kinds of thoughts. You will think about tomorrow, you'll think about the future, you replace something, you might have a fantasy, you might have a plan. None of it is in your control. If you choose to, you can direct your mind, I'm gonna choose to think about X, and then you can do that. But you very quickly lose that track, and your mind is off on its own. It's like we're riding in a train and we don't know who the conductor is. And if you practice like mindful meditation, a lot of what you do is just watch that crazy train move around, and see if you can learn something about it. Well, Freud says that thing, which also happens when we dream, right? When you fall asleep, when you have the thing that you call dream, that's exactly what's happening. That is the way that most of our life happens. Most of our mental activity is of that sort. And then Freud gives us tools and ways to try to investigate that, try to understand what is going on in that subterranean aspect of mentation. And learning to live this way, learning to live with an alertness and tools with which to investigate that unconscious aspect of our life, profoundly enriches your life, profoundly enriches your relationship. And in my view, it adds this extraordinary dimension to Socrates' injunction about the examined life. I think after Freud, the examined life gains a depth and a dimension that I think makes Freud one of the great thinkers, not just of the 20th century, but of our philosophical past. One does have to grant that Freud tried to put all this into clinical application, and a lot of his clinical theories and applications we have kind of superseded. They just don't hold up. But that, I think, has often led people to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say, and in fact has given them an excuse to not take Freud seriously, because Freud's insights are profoundly unsettling. To think of yourself as not in control of yourself, to think of yourself as a kind of riding a wild tiger, really decenters you, and it can be profoundly disturbing.
It's interesting that with Newton, for example, we take his physics theories, we don't let the fact that he spent much more time on the numerology of the Bible get in our way. Exactly. And sometimes, the couple of insights that Freud had, like this basic thing, the real reasons are not the reasons that you think you're doing what you're doing for. That if that was the only insight that he had, and he applied it inaccurately himself the whole time, it'd still be very useful to the rest of us.
Yes. So, absolutely. We have to remember that Freud, before Freud turned to psychology, he's a neurophysiology, a researcher in neurophysiology. He's in a lab with a microscope studying the nervous system of mollusks, right? Of invertebrate. He turns to seeing patients really because he needs to make money. He wants to get married. He's in love and he needs to make some money. So he starts seeing people that were referred to neurophysiologists because they were believed to be suffering from some kind of nervous condition. And and then that opens up this whole world for Freud, and he spends his life trying to fit this new thing. He has this new panorama that has opened up, trying to fit it into the scientific, medical, professional vocabulary in which in which he trained. And it was never a good fit.
Yeah, never a good fit. You mentioned dreaming. I just want to say one thing about dreaming. I think people focus a lot of different elements of dreaming, but what I find fascinating is how similar dreams in visual elements are to near-death experiences that people have been having. That is that you have this world full of light, and you keep making the light into forms that then exist, and so it's sort of this liquid light that you create things out of. And that seems to be an indicator that what's going on in our mind. Our minds are maybe this kind of light being sort of thing, we have that in, but that's a whole other topic altogether. but it's fascinating that's never really been, that part of our life that takes up so much of our life, but not with other people, just in our own minds. Is yet another indicator. There's got to be something going on about that whole part of life that we talk about, but really don't seem to have any idea from a rational point of view.
Yeah, and it's an example of how our kind of rational, intellectual, scholarly lives come into ignore or overlook, are at odds with some very fundamental aspects of our humanity. Yeah. And of course, traditional cultures, every culture has a kind of a sense that dreams are meaningful, that there is something about dreams. Dreams are not random. Dreams are not to be ignored. Yet we come to the scientific revolution, the 17th century, the Enlightenment, and suddenly dreams are, just forget it, just ignore them. Just make believe it, they don't exist. They're random, meaningless. But of course they're not. How could they be?
No, if we can't measure it, we can't know it. But we know lots of things without measuring them. But we've made so much progress on that material knowledge that, of course, anytime something is in ascendance, it kind of wants to eliminate everything else. But just like the three kinds of universities, all three can coexist in the same place for everybody. We don't need to get rid of research. We don't need to get rid of liberal arts, and we don't need to get rid of career training.
That's right.
And we don't need to get rid of our emotions just because we can't measure them, because that's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we can't skip Gandhi. I know that is such an interesting character personally, and you again, just like with Freud, Gandhi's known for a couple of things that make him seem strange to people, but his focus, his intellectual focus, and I think what I thought was very clever about him was he knew what would move the British culture. He knew what would be more effective in changing their minds about the fact that they are racist and colonialism and so on and so forth. So why don't you talk a little bit about Gandhi? We have a few minutes left. We can't skip it.
Yeah. I love teaching Gandhi, and Gandhi has been a really important figure in my own intellectual development. And Gandhi brings a number of concepts, practices, ideas into the ethical, political universe that people in the West might know as a tradition. One of them is the idea of nonviolence, probably the thing that he's most famous for, and he has a notion of soul force. He has a notion of a kind of power that can be activated by one's dedicated commitment to nonviolence and truth. And in fact, he thinks that nonviolence is simply an aspect, a facet of a pursuit of truth. Gandhi, for example, in his opposition to British rule in India, he insists, I don't want to defeat the British, I want to transform the British. Gandhi saw his enemies not as individuals to conquer, but as individuals to turn into friends, to find a way to unlock the inner light, the inner goodness of every person. And Gandhi thinks that the most effective way to do that is to create situations in which their injustice or their prejudice or their selfishness causes you to suffer in a direct way. And Gandhi thinks that no individual can long withstand innocent suffering caused by their own injustice. Gandhi thinks that unjust suffering, bravely withstood without malice to the oppressor, will transform a heart of stone. Now, many people say, no, that's incredible. That can't work. And I say, look at Gandhi's life and look what he was able to achieve in South Africa, in India, in his immediate environment. And I often think that if Gandhi had lived, say, in the 12th century or in the 13th century, and we would read his life story, we would think that it's made up. We would think like, oh, this is just a hagiography. This is just people attributing kind of larger than life and fantastical powers. But Gandhi is a figure of the 21st century, one of the best documented lives in the world. So Gandhi, in my view, gives us a way to resist, question, and challenge the postmodern assault on truth. And by postmodern, there's a kind of theoretical academic school associated with that, and I don't mean to tarnish all of what's called postmodernism with this attitude. And a lot of this attitude, this kind of post-truth or anti-truth, is not an academic at all, in academia at all, but it's in the kind of in the broader culture. But Gandhi, I think, gives us a way to recover a sense of the value and integrity of a notion of truth, and of notions like the value and power of things like honesty, self-sacrifice, nonviolence. Gandhi really has a message for the world that seems to me to command the attention of every person, every single individual. I think every one of us would benefit from taking Gandhi seriously. So, we don't have time to go into it.
Yeah.
Go read some Gandhi. You can read my book, and it'll give you some pointers as to how to get into Gandhi. But I think that he has something to say that is utterly important in our contemporary world.
And just as with Socrates, if you don't get the motive right, you're not going to experience it. As the saying in Hollywood goes, if you can fake sincerity, then you've got it made here. And if you can fake what he stood for, you're not going to get anywhere of what he wants, of what he was trying to accomplish.
It in fact can't be faked.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
You completely eliminate your ability to have the soul force there. One thing I did want to say about it.
The means are impossible to separate from the ends.
That's right.
We have a delusion that we can separate the ends from the means, but they in fact are one.
Yeah. You cannot achieve a just end without just means.
Right.
It's just impossible. You can't get there. The one thing, I think one thing about science that's helpful on the ahimsa, approach of nonviolence is that we know that we are, mass murdering bacteria on a daily basis with our bodies, and that our bodies, are going to do that all the time. And so I think that fact helps us decide between what's really at play here. And it seems to me that it's not being cruel, not wanting to gain your pleasure off of the pain of other people. This is one of Gandhi's points, is it's very hard when you're faced with the idea that someone that you cannot say, you said innocent sufferer, someone that you cannot say deserves, nobody deserves cruelty, but you can pretend that your enemy deserves cruelty because they're trying to kill you too. But if it's somebody that's totally innocent and you're being cruel to them and making them suffer, you're faced with that. If you're made to face that so clearly, some people won't back down, but the vast majority will back down off of that.
The fact is that violence requires violence to be fed. It's like a fire.
Yeah.
And it will burn out before long unless it meets violence back. It simply cannot be sustained. Hatred is the same. If somebody hates you and you love them back consistently and with a pure heart, it will dissolve the hatred. The person literally cannot continue to hate you in the face of receiving love back. Now, doing that is not easy, and it requires a kind of inner transformation and almost like a superhuman development of spirit and force. So just Gandhi's whole life is a series of rigors and practices and efforts to develop this kind of pure will. But it's really onto something that the violence, aggression, hatred requires reciprocation in order to survive.
And that these ideas that these thinkers have given to human culture, that they're in our self-interest, in our pursuit of happiness, I think is the crucial point and the crucial point in liberal arts education, and what people can get out of it. And those who can't get to a school, the books are available. You can do the reading, and if you can find somebody who can help you get through them a little bit, that's good. You can get 70% of it, but obviously meeting somebody like Gandhi or meeting somebody like Jesus or Socrates or everything is part of the inspiration that makes people, walk away and say, this is possible. This is something that can be accomplished. Of course, as soon as we say that, then we turn them into a gods that that says, well, he could do it because he was different than us, but actually everybody can do this. Everybody.
That's the whole point. That's the whole point.
That's right. That's the whole point of liberal education. And that everybody can become confused first.
Exactly. That's part of it.
That's part of it. Thank you very much, Roosevelt. That was an excellent conversation, a great book. Thanks for joining us at the Commonwealth Club. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 119th year of enlightened discussion. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.